Welcome back. Today is about the medieval imagination, not in art, not in architecture, not even in those illuminated manuscripts featuring angry rabbits with lances. No, today we look at that rich, uniquely European talent for the creative punishment of fellow human beings. Because when it came to making someone regret their life choices, medieval authorities, secular and sacred alike, had no shortage of ideas. From the gruesome to the farcical, from public embarrassment to irreversible mutilation, the Middle Ages perfected the theatre of consequence. Yet beneath the iron and fire, behind every scaffold and stool, was a society grappling with fear, lawlessness, and a deep need for control. These punishments were not simply cruel, they were designed with purpose, misguided often, but purpose nonetheless. Let us begin with the most theatrical tool in the medieval justice toolkit, the pillory. You've seen it, even if only in cartoons, a wooden board with 3 holes, 1 for the neck, 2 for the wrists, locking the unfortunate individual in an upright bow before the judgmental stares of the community. This was punishment by exposure. It didn't matter what your crime was, stealing bread, forging letters, spreading rumors. Once your head and hands were secured in the pillory, your punishment was no longer about justice. It was about performance. People would gather, food would fly, sometimes insults, sometimes rocks. And if the local youth were feeling inspired, maybe a dead rat or two, you were trapped, quite literally, in the hands of public opinion. Sometimes the real sentence began after your release, not to be confused with the stocks, of course, which worked on a similar principle but focused lower down. In the stocks, your legs and occasionally arms were clamped in place. You could sit but not lie down, you could fidget but not escape. The longer you remained, the more unbearable it became. Not because of pain, but because of boredom, exposure, and the growing certainty that your neighbors were not as sympathetic as you once believed. Children were fond of the stocks, not because they were punished in them, though that did happen, but because they could pelt the accused with whatever the local ecology provided. A goose feather here, a cow pat there. Delightful. But if you were particularly unlucky and female, you might have encountered a punishment that was as humiliating as it was grotesque, the scold's bridle, also known as the brank. It resembled a metal cage fitted over the head with a gag-like plate pressing against the tongue. Sometimes it had spikes. This device was reserved for women who were said to talk too much, nag too loudly, or speak ill of others. A scold was not criminal in the legal sense, but a nuisance in the domestic one, so they were silenced, literally. The bridle prevented speech and often inflicted pain if the wearer tried to resist. The punishment was not just physical, it was deeply social. The wearer was paraded through the town, sometimes chained to a post or forced to confess. It was a morality play with a metal script, and for many women it was a lifetime brand, long after the iron was removed. Now for the men, especially the rowdy, drunken, musically inclined types, there was the shame flute. It sounds whimsical, but in execution it was anything but. This was an iron collar with an attached tube shaped like a recorder or flute, fixed before the offender's mouth. It was intended for bad musicians or drunkards who disturbed the peace. The device rendered them silent, but also publicly ridiculous. They were walked through the streets as a warning to others. Play your lute properly, or the flute plays you. It was rarely fatal, just unforgettable. Of course, Some punishments skipped the performance and went straight for the pain. Consider the chevalet, or wooden donkey. Imagine a narrow triangle of wood, point up, like a horse's spine. The condemned was made to sit astride it, as one would a horse, except this horse had no mercy. Weights were tied to the ankles, and the victim's own body weight did the rest. This was a military punishment, often reserved for insubordination or cowardice, and while it rarely killed, it could tear tendons, rupture skin, and shatter one's confidence in authority. Some versions were more elaborate, with spikes. Others simply relied on gravity and time. It was punishment by geometry. A similarly inventive but less violent method was the drunkard's cloak. This was a barrel, yes, a literal barrel, cut to accommodate the body, worn over the shoulders with arms and legs poking out awkwardly. Offenders would be paraded through town, forced to endure ridicule and the peculiar chafing of wooden punishment. The idea was to shame them into sobriety. Whether it worked is up for debate, but the method lived on in various forms across Europe. Sometimes it was a tub, sometimes a tub with antlers attached. Medieval creativity knew no bounds, especially when alcohol was involved. But not all punishments involved wood and iron. Some were far more mystical in nature. Trial by ordeal, for instance, was divine justice outsourced to physics, suspected of theft. You might be asked to carry a red-hot iron for a few paces. The wound would then be bound. If it healed cleanly, you were innocent. If it festered, well, God had spoken. Another version involved plunging your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. Yet another saw you tied up and thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, guilty. This was especially popular during witch hunts. It was less a trial than a coin toss, one with considerably more steam. Speaking of steam, there's boiling alive. Not common, but not unheard of. Henry VIII authorized it for poisoners. The condemned would be submerged in a cauldron of water, oil, or tar, and slowly cooked. There was no quick end. It was punishment and message, a brutal fusion of spectacle and deterrence. And though rare, it was remembered, etched into the cultural memory, much like the accused themselves were into the pot. Still, if you were lucky, you might only be branded. Criminals were often marked with hot irons. T for thief, F for felon, V for vagrant. Branding was the medieval equivalent of a criminal record, but far more permanent. Some were branded on the cheek, others the hand. For repeat offenders, it might be both. And once branded, always watched. Society had no forgiveness, only surveillance. If that seems grim, consider the heretic's fork. This was a metal rod with sharp prongs at each end, placed between the chin and chest, or chest and throat, secured with straps. The wearer could not move their head, speak, or rest. If they did, the prongs pierced flesh. It was used by inquisitors to extract confessions or prevent heretics from sleeping. Sleep deprivation as piety. The fork itself didn't kill, but it slowly unraveled the mind, which in many cases was the goal. Even animals weren't safe. Animal trials were a bizarre phenomenon, particularly in France. Pigs, dogs, even insects were summoned to court. If a pig killed a child, it might be dressed in clothes, appointed a lawyer, and sentenced to death. It sounds absurd, and it was, but the logic was deadly serious. Justice, even symbolic, had to be served. These trials were rituals, social catharsis, and in their way performances of order. One of the darkest punishments was the wheel, also known as breaking on the wheel, a form of execution in which the criminal's limbs were shattered with an iron bar, then threaded through the spokes of a cartwheel. Sometimes they were left alive to die slowly under the sky. In some Germanic regions, this was seen as fitting for murderers, traitors, or bandits. It was excruciatingly slow, designed not just to kill, but to unmake. Some punishments aimed not to kill or mark, but to erase. Exile was one such sentence. To be cast out, banished, was to lose one's legal existence. In Iceland, the outlaw could be killed on sight. In France or Italy, exile meant your property seized, your name struck from record. You weren't simply removed, you were undone. And when all else failed, there was the oubliette. A dungeon with no door, only a hole in the ceiling. You were dropped in, that was it. No ladder, no light, no voice. The name means forgotten place. And it delivered exactly that. If you were fed, it was rare. If you were remembered, it was worse, because it meant they could come back. There were live entombments too, used for nuns or monks who broke their vows. A cell sealed around them, food passed through a grate, their life slowly consumed by darkness and regret. And false coronations, ritual humiliations where disgraced clergy were dressed in mock robes and paraded in shame. There were coffin cages, public executions, ritual burnings, even posthumous punishments where corpses were exhumed and tried. Because justice in the Middle Ages was not just about crime, it was about order. It was about reminding everyone watching that the law was eternal, even if the body was not. These punishments seem absurd, cruel, theatrical, and they were. But they also came from a place of deep social anxiety, about sin, about chaos, about how thin the walls of society really were. And behind every iron mask, every wheel and brand, there was a person, guilty or innocent, loved or hated, human all the same. Their stories echo through time, not to glorify suffering, but to remind us of what fear and power can do when left unexamined. And I hope you enjoyed this story. Until the next time, goodbye.